All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I think this is our fifth CMP More Collaborative Learning Initiative mini webinar. This week, we are featuring our global/national environment and development agendas group, and excited to hear from them. So we'll have a presentation from this group, and then we'll have some time for some question and answers at the end. And if you would be so kind as to type your questions in the chat box, that way I can save them and read them off at the time for question and answers, or at that time, you can also chime in with your microphone. But if you have questions as they come up throughout the presentation, feel free to use the chat function. But I will let Sheila take it away now.
Okay, hi everybody. I think I know most people, which is really exciting to see. I'm going to kick off the presentation, but I just wanted to apologize. I have internet connection issues. They keep saying that they're unstable, so I'm going to have to turn my camera off while I'm speaking, just so that we don't have any mishaps. So forgive me for doing that, but let me go to, wait a second, that didn't work. Okay, so can you see my screen?
No.
No.
It said you were sharing very briefly, and then it went away.
Okay, let me go share. Keeps disappearing. Hold on, there we go. Hopefully that's.
Yep.
Yeah, that worked.
That worked. Okay. So yes, hello, welcome everyone. The group that's presenting the results of our learning initiative today is myself, Charles, Tanya, and Sabina. Of course, we're only part of the group that worked on trying to understand a little bit more about global and national environment and development agendas as strategies for conservation. And I'll show you a fuller list of people who participated in this as we go along. So let's see. So what we're going to try and walk you through in the next half hour is I'll give a little, myself, I'm going to give a little introduction and background to this learning initiative. Then Charles is going to take us through the situation analysis and theory of change that we developed. And Tanya is going to present one of the case studies that we used to help us validate our thinking. And then Sabina is going to walk us through some of the key issues, lessons learned, and some of the recommendations that we came up with for future research. So as you probably already heard, because you've heard from Erica and Elizabeth, who were part of what we called the Strategies Learning Initiative, which was CMP More supported effort. The purpose of these learning initiatives was to try and look at strategies that are either in current use or they may have a new application, and we wanted to think about them a little bit more and try and improve their effective application. So today, one of the selected strategies or strategic approaches is the broader environment development agendas and their links to conservation. So I coordinated that group. What we did was explored how these global national agendas could be used as strategies, how they could be, and also how they could be influenced by the conservation efforts that are delivered at local, national, or regional scales. I just wanted to say this, we did not undertake a general analysis of these big agendas. So if anybody, is disappointed and you want to get off now, go ahead. But we were trying to look at their use as strategies and also how we could influence global agendas by working in conservation at different levels. So some of the uses we felt that were valuable from the work that we undertook. One was to capture the current knowledge on the use of global national environment development agendas for conservation efforts, hoping to also improve future studies on how to better leverage these agendas for conservation. Also, we wanted to vet assumptions that are used to craft situation analysis and theory of change, both ours as we develop them, but also for others who may be considering using environment and development agendas. And that leads to also clarifying how you can practically apply global and national agendas for integrated conservation and development issues. And we wanted to contribute to building the CAMA library with a common framework that can be adapted for use in different contexts. So let's see. So the participants of this group, we had a core working group was in the left-hand column. The people who are highlighted are the people who are presenting the results of the kind of participants in this learning initiative. And then we had several people who provided case studies. So it was quite, a large group, and it came from different walks of life and had different experiences. So we're very grateful for everybody who did help us with this effort. Some of the activities that we undertook, we had that initial call for participants and asked each of those who indicated they would like to participate in the learning group to try and provide resources, either literature or any type of information that might be useful for us. We undertook 3 convenings. We had 2 sessions each for those convenings, 4 surveys and a couple of polls. And we ended up with 3 case studies that were more fully developed. As I mentioned, we had a core working group who tried to synthesize and put everything together. We did a small literature search, not a huge one. And with the short reports after each convening, we hoped people would be, contribute additional comments so that we had a lot of interaction in developing the final product, which is obviously available to everybody on this call. The key questions that we were addressing through this learning initiative, the first was really around, is there a generic situation analysis and theory of change, both for leveraging global environment and development agendas, but also for influencing those agendas as well. That could then be adapted for use in within different contexts, local contexts, regional contexts. But we were mostly looking during our work at subnational level. The second thing we were trying to do is look at key issues and derive lessons from experiences and the case studies, anything we could get out of the literature within the time frame that we had that could help us understand how to make the use of environment and development agendas as strategies for conservation practical, so that we're really appealing to the practitioner crowd, although there's a number of other groups who we felt could benefit from this exercise. And then we looked at some of the research priorities for going forward. So there were a lot of limitations in what we did, and we felt it was important just to share these with you. It was non-systematic review. Trying to interpret the literature was a little difficult. We really didn't find much in the way that spoke directly to using big agendas as strategies for conservation, especially at subnational levels. The small sample size, especially with our case studies. And then, there was some overlaps, obviously, with the developing theory of change, because we, vetted that against our case studies. And really, we consider this a work in progress. I don't think that's a limitation, actually. I think that's exciting because, none of us who were involved in the working group or who are on this call presenting the results of the learning group, we didn't feel we were experts in this matter, but we felt it was really important to bring people together to try and learn how we could use these agendas to the benefit of conservation and also to influence the agendas going forward. So, so where did we get to? The definition and general description we got to was that, global environment and development agendas they're high-level political processes. They typically involve government-to-government interactions and commitments. Of course, they can be influenced by outside factors, but really these are processes that the governments themselves are developing together and then committing to implement. They have these implications at many different scales, and they typically focus on sustainable development outcomes. For us, the middle line here, we felt that this came as close to as we could come to a definition, which is that as conservation strategies, these agendas serve to influence and leverage high-level government and corporate commitments to facilitate more effective conservation and human well-being outcomes. Some examples of the agendas which could be leveraged, the SDGs, the Convention to Combat Desertification, the CBD, World Heritage Convention, there's many others, UNFCCC. So we mostly focused on SDG, CBD, although you will also hear the case study we're talking about today is linked to UNFCCC. We felt that when leveraging these agendas for conservation, the results could be more favorable policy or legislation, creating powerful and purposeful common agendas that can be shared at different scales, that there was a way to recognize more explicitly the human well-being benefits of nature and nature-based solutions, that you could end up with an increased resource availability for conservation work, and also create greater credibility, relevance, and legitimacy of conservation work, because these agendas are so important at national levels and global levels. Potentially increase the recognition for civil society movements and, strengthen the sustainability of these localized efforts. So the main purpose we felt of using these big agendas as strategy was to bring about this global, national, and local changes amongst different actors and stakeholders whose decisions and actions affect biodiversity and human well-being. Again, there's a lot on the screen here, but just a couple of additional points. Some of these are a little repetitive, but why did we think that this was important to do and learn together? So some of the points that haven't been made already was, that there's often this disconnect. We heard about this in the very first survey that we did, between local context and global or national level understanding and decision making. And somehow we had to bring those closer together. And also just to show how, how are these agendas useful to deliver conservation and human well-being outcomes, and in turn to influence the setting of the agendas, because that conversation or that influencing doesn't seem to happen particularly often. So we tried to come up with some defining characteristics. I mean, what makes this, using these agendas as a strategy, different from other approaches? And, some of it was that they focus on sustainable development. Typically, since it's government to government, they're thinking at a national scale. leveraging these high-level commitments to facilitate more localized conservation outcomes, we felt was an important defining characteristic. Trying to identify or create rewards to governments and corporations for their presence in global arenas. And, you know, using the commitments and the achievement of those commitments as a way to potentially reward governments for actually, you know, doing the right thing. And that talks to the delivery on those commitments that they've made. So this is where I stop sharing, and I'm going to hand over to Charles, where he's going to lead us into some of the more the nitty gritty, sort of the depth of what we talked about in our learning group.
Thank you, Sheila. Can you hear me okay and see my screen?
Yes.
Great. Yeah, so once the first part of the work with the working group was really about agreeing on the scope of the work through the definition that Sheila just presented. So once this was done, then we could start identifying some opportunities and barriers for organizations to work with global and national agendas. So that was the situation analysis. And then we flipped the situation analysis and the conceptual models into results chains to identify the results that we felt were necessary for organizations to effectively work with global and national agendas. That's what I'll be presenting. So when we started populating or identifying barriers and opportunities, pretty soon we started trying to group them and to organize them depending on 6 key actors. So we felt that this helped manage some of the complexity. So the actors that we identified were conservation organizations that can either implement on-the-ground projects at subnational levels or try to influence global and national agendas. Then foundations that support the work of conservation organizations, civil society that also have a lot of interactions with conservation organizations, and that also, in some countries, elect and put pressure on high-level governments so that they engage with those agendas. The private and corporate sector that also have a lot of interaction with civil society and through supply and demand for their products and services. Of course, high-level governments that decide whether they're going to be parties of those agendas or not. And then international organizations that try to bring everybody together to work in a coordinated fashion. So at a very high level, we tried to, or we decided to depict or to show the global and national agendas as strategies that try to influence things at a global and national level. So whether it be threats or biodiversity, supporting ecosystem services, or ultimately human well-being. So the question that we were asking through this learning initiative is, what are the barriers and opportunities for organizations working below this level to be able to influence or leverage the agendas when they're working, for example, on projects addressing local threats, local biodiversity, ecosystem services, or human well-being. So that's showing again the same situation analysis, but we started to, or we start showing some of the opportunities and barriers associated with the various actors that we have identified. So again, here, can everybody see my arrow when I'm pointing to the diagram?
Yeah, I see it.
Okay, good.
Sure.
So at a very high level, this is the global scene. This is the local scene at the bottom. Here we have the international organizations. Below we have the high-level governments. We have the conservation organizations, the foundations, civil society, and the corporate sector. So we've identified two main strategies that conservation organizations can adopt when working with global agendas. So either you're trying to implement on-the-ground conservation projects, so that's the top-down strategy here below, and you're trying to leverage the global agendas so that you can increase the impact of your project. So when you, of course, you're going to be dealing with internal barriers and opportunities within your conservation organization. And we felt like this factor here in the middle, access to resources when subnational initiatives are aligned with global agendas, was really key in linking everything together. So ultimately, all the actors kind of integrate when they start funneling money or funds towards the conservation organizations that do help leverage the global agendas. The other strategy that conservation organizations can adopt is not trying to implement on-the-ground projects, but rather to influence the global agenda. So it's more of a bottom-up approach where you're trying to influence the language of the agendas or the commitment of your high-level governments. So there's various ways through which you can interact with those actors. So you can either go all the way up to international organizations, you can go up to high-level governments, or you can go through the corporate sector, which then can push their priorities to the high-level governments, or you can try to work with civil society, which will then elect or put pressure on high-level governments. Then we flipped those opportunities, so the situation analysis, into results chains, where we transformed the opportunities and barriers into results that we felt were necessary for organizations to be successful. All of the results for each of the actors were broken down into many results. So I'm not expecting you to read any of this. It's just to show you that, so all of the gray boxes or the group boxes are factors that are related to all of the actors that, or results that are related to all of the actors that we identified previously. So a bunch of results for the corporate sector, high-level governments, civil society, and for conservation organizations. So I'm just going to show you a zoom in into the bottom one here, for expected results for conservation organizations. So one of the things that we did, or that we asked participants, was to prioritize the results so that we can know which ones are most important for conservation organizations to consider when they're working with global agendas. So the main one is trying to, the prioritized items are the ones where you see the text is larger. So this one here was deemed most important. So it was felt like organizations needed to set up collaborations to increase collective impact and allow to scale up initiatives. So here it is expected that if you do this, then you'll be able to demonstrate how you can, your organization and your project can help governments meet their commitments towards global and national agenda goals. So if you're able to use effective messaging and reach out to those governments and show that your projects can help them, then they're going to start noticing you and hopefully providing you with support through policies and funding. Another item that was deemed very important was ensuring that language, economic, and cultural differences were understood and accommodated to ensure equal opportunities to participate. And then this was thought to lead to meaningful engagement of local stakeholders, and where appropriate, and this was found to be very effective in one of our case studies. When appropriate, set up organization networks or alliances to effectively help coordinate efforts so that you can be more people working together on similar initiatives. And then this would allow, or this would lead to the ability to scale up initiatives, and again, to help governments make progress to their international commitments. So like I mentioned, we ground-truthed some of those factors using case studies. So now we're going to hear about Tamia's case study, and I will pass it to you, Tamia.
Hi, everyone. Okay, let me change share my screen. This will stop that. And this. All right. Let me see if this works.
Yep, it's working.
It's working. Is it passing? You're now sharing your screen. Okay. Hi, everyone. So today I'll present one of the 3 case studies used for this learning initiative. It's an indigenous-led effort that today is supporting Peru to achieve its climate change commitments according to the Paris Agreement. So, so the case study, it's called Ria Maracaeri, and I'll tell you a little bit what those things mean in a second. So RIA means Red Indígena Amazónica, and it was proposed by indigenous organizations, a Peruvian indigenous organization, and then the Amazon Basin organization COICA, between 2010 and 2011 as a protest of indigenous peoples against Red Plus. It adapts the Red Plus mechanisms to the indigenous cosmovisions, their rights, and development priorities. So they went ahead and proposed this. And that was fine at the beginning, but then they found this difficulty of how do I implement this idea? So they needed pilots, and they decided to go ahead with 3 pilots. One in Colombia, one in Brazil, and the other one in Peru, which is the one that I'm presenting in the Maracaeri Communal Reserve. And another difficulty at the beginning, of course, with not only how do I implement and I show how this RIA works in the Amazon, was that since it was a new concept, it needed to be integrated into national policy. So that's what RIA is, and I'll be referring the whole time about RIA, but it's the RED policy adapted to indigenous peoples from the Amazon. So the case study of RIA in Peru took place in the Maracaeri Communal Reserve. This is a protected area in southern Peru in the Amazon, in the region of Madre de Dios. The size of the protected area is about 400,000 hectares, and around the protected area there are 10 communities that are about 162,000 hectares. And the cool thing about this type of protected areas in Peru is that it is co-managed. So that means that the management of the protected area is in between the National Service of Protected Areas, or NAM, and what is called the ECA, which is representatives from the 10 indigenous communities that surround the Amarakaeri Reserve, form this organization called the ECA, and that they have the legal responsibility to co-manage the reserve with the National Protected Area Service. And as with other protected areas, you know, it has a master plan. It has, the indigenous communities have life plans, and all these then were used to go from local to national and then global through the Paris Agreement and those climate change commitments. So the targets of Ria Maracaieri were to protect the forest, was the forest in itself. So they added all the forests, the forest in the 10 indigenous communities, plus the forest of the protected area. And of course, there was also human well-being targets, mainly related to their land rights and economic activities. And the strategy, and they have been really smart about this. So the indigenous leaders of the Amarakaeri Reserve have been doing this for a very long time. I think probably since 2014, raising funds and doing this. So what they have done is that they have aligned what says in the master plan of the protected area with the 10 life plans of each community. And a life plan is like a document that says more or less what are they supposed to do, how they do it. It's like a master plan for a community. And all that is aligned with these conservation agreements. So the conservation agreements put together the master plan with the life plan and ties everything together. So by implementing these master plans and life plans, then they're contributing towards Peru's national determined contribution commitments that are in Peru's national strategy of forest and climate change. And then this, with a bunch of other data and indicators, then this contributes towards the Paris Agreement, the UNFCCC. So the expected results is to reduce still current greenhouse gas emissions by avoiding deforestation of all the forests and communities plus the protected area in itself, secure the land rights of the 10 indigenous communities, and implement these master plans and life plans. So there were many opportunities and advantages, and like I said, this has been a very successful project in Peru, and today is a model. One of the big opportunities is that it has allowed not only the Amarakaeri Communal Reserve and the indigenous leaders to participate in COPs, but IDESEP and all the indigenous organizations to have a voice and have something to present in these meetings. Ria Maracaieri today is a model, and I think they even have a project, a huge project with all the other 9 communal reserves in Peru. So that is almost 2.2 million hectares. So it has a lot of implications for the country and for conservation and for Peru's commitments. One of the advantages is that most of the indigenous organizations have supported both at like a regional Amazonian level, but also at the local level in Peru, in Madre de Dios. So from FENAMAD and all the organizations in Madre de Dios to IDESEP and then to COICA. So this has given them a lot of validity in this initiative. And also another advantage was that since they co-manage the protected area with the National Park Service, sometimes those barriers that perhaps Charles was talking about in between communicating and going from the very local level to the subnational and then to the national, having CERNAMP, the National Protected Area Service, in there as a partner has facilitated that dialogue and that communication. They have also, I didn't put that in here, but they have also had access to funding, to climate change funding that has helped them advance some of these goals. In terms of barriers or difficulties, there is always a financial difficulty raising funds to implement the project and the lack of capacity to manage grants and funds. For example, USAID is a big one where they can't manage the funds, that there is money for these kind of projects. So what has been key in this has been partnerships with civil society, which has also, another difficulty is the technical difficulties in monitoring and implementing all the activities that they have framed in their master plans and life plans and conservation agreements. So partnerships with other NGOs, universities, government have been key, but this is a place where all the threats you can imagine are in here. So it's a difficult place to work, but they have been very successful, I have to say. And difficulty coordinating activities between the multiple national government entities. Again, going from very local indigenous leaders to indigenous organizations, and then between the regional government, the national government, it gets a little bit complicated. But like I said, this has been a model in Peru, and it's being scaled up to other communal reserves. So that's the case study that I was going to present, and now Sabina is going to present the other two case studies and finish the presentation for today. Thank you very much.
Okay, so everybody should be able to see my screen. Can you see it?
Yep.
Okay, great.
Okay.
So we also had two other case studies within our work that we use to vet our theory of change with. And one of them was from the MAVA Foundation, which facilitated the designation of important marine mammal areas in the Mediterranean Sea. And they leveraged a regional agreement on the conservation of cetaceans, the Convention on Biological Diversity, the IUCN Key Biodiversity Areas, and the Convention on Migratory Species. So those were their agendas that they used to conduct their work. And the other case study was by Tour du Valat of the Mediterranean Wetlands Alliance, and they leveraged the Convention on Biological Diversity to advance the conservation of wetlands within the Mediterranean basin. And some of the learning lessons from these case studies would be specifically when there's a multi-jurisdictional aspect to your work, you need the participation of the resident expert communities of those member states in order to build the legitimacy and credibility with those governments that you're looking to influence, because they would like to see representation in those sorts of knowledge production and decision-making processes before they make a larger political commitment. You also could leverage regionally recognized agreements if you would like to bolster the relevance of pursuing a global agreement. You do need sufficient scale to demonstrate your meaningful impacts toward global and regional targets. You have to be able to do something that could put like a recognizable dent on these targets. You also need to, one thing that these agendas can help you with is to access resources and stakeholders that you could not access if you were using another conservation strategy, simply because maybe the national government doesn't recognize the usefulness of your other work. But when you link it to something that they've committed to at an international or national level, then it becomes in their interest to support you and to give you the resources and access that you need to be successful. You will need partnerships for these types of this type of work using these agendas in order to reach your scale and to overcome some critical technical difficulties. And so you need a very strategic institutional design to align the different visions that you and approaches of your different actors involved. You will need some sorts of mechanisms to balance power dynamics amongst these actors within your partnership. And when you're balancing those power dynamics, that also helps these partners maintain the credibility and legitimacy within their own constituencies. And that encourages them to stay with the partnership versus if that credibility and legitimacy was being, or their reputation was being eroded by being in that partnership. And these sorts of partnerships enable peer-to-peer learning, which also builds trust and strengthens those the type of social license that you need to operate. Finally, if you're working with these sorts of agendas and these partnerships, you may need to adopt an interest in issues or some roles and some tasks which are traditionally outside of your normal focus, just so that you can fill in some gaps within those partnerships that maybe your partners are unable to do so, but which are necessary for success. So under what conditions would such a strategy be necessary and appropriate? So it's definitely appropriate when there is the national government has made a binding commitment to an agenda, and you can use this high-level commitment to persuade national agencies and subnational governments to adopt some measures that in the past they've been reluctant to do so. So it could be, for example, the gazettement of protected areas. And often these types of agendas, they require some sort of cross-sectorial collaboration. So you can also use this sort of commitment to push forward new institutional arrangements, such as like interministerial or stakeholder roundtables. And these sorts of structures are also very useful for other types of conservation work. It might also be necessary and appropriate to use this strategy when leadership is required to align multiple agencies at multiple scales, and you need them to adopt a common theory of change in order to have collective impact. So an example would be when you need maybe the forestry or the agricultural departments sectors to work together on managing agroforestry concessions. That's where they interact, but they may have different conceptions of what agroforestry is. So you can place yourself in a leadership position for that using an agenda. You can also, these strategies are also important and necessary and appropriate when there are strong conservation or human well-being achievements that have already been secured in a particular context. And you need something else to help protect what has already been hard won. And the agendas can lend to that. So this is towards protecting what is already there rather than having to find resources to remediate what you lose. Again, so what else could these strategies be necessary and appropriate for? When there's a desperate need for good governance mechanisms, and the agendas can justify and support efforts to establish, for example, monitoring and evaluation and reporting frameworks and for stakeholder consultations. So this might particularly be helpful, for example, when there are international supply chains involved in the extraction of wildlife at a local level, or there are payment for ecosystem services schemes which involve international transactions. And so therefore you would need these sorts of good governance mechanisms in place. You can also use these when the agenda provides like a window of opportunity for you to do a precedent-setting proof of concept on an issue that has been systematically hard to tackle. And you need this demonstration project to kind of challenge business as usual assumptions and challenge perceptions of risks associated with trying, for example, a new solution, for example, nature-based solutions. And it's also may be appropriate to use these strategies when a conservation organization and its partners has the credibility, which is basically the competency, and the legitimacy, which is your social license, to navigate very complex negotiations and sensitive conflicts amongst stakeholders. So what are some major barriers to the uptake and successful application of such a strategy? Well, there are, of course, you're often dealing with governments, like national government, and as governments change, there's also a change in the political will and national agendas. And so these sorts of changes can introduce risk within your investment, particularly if you've already developed like a 5-year program, and within 2 years, you know that there's going to be an election. So there's a certain risk to investing in that. These strategies, they often, well, they require behavioral change, not only at the individual level, but at the institutional level. And behavior change is a lengthy process, and it's non-linear, and it's sometimes counterintuitive, especially at the individual level, much less when you're dealing at the institutional level. And so this introduces uncertainties within your theories of change, and that would affect your timely delivery of your project outcomes. These sorts of agendas, they are also complex institutions, so very complex sets of rules about roles and duties and funding streams and reporting mechanisms. And often even governments are at a complete loss of how to navigate these sorts of institutional arrangements. And so this can really affect whether you can leverage this type of strategy. Other barriers would include social conflict. So in some places you have really deep and chronic conflicts to very sensitive issues such as land tenure. And these can give rise to perceived or real irreconcilable differences amongst your stakeholders. And in these situations, you can't simply just jump in. It requires like very sophisticated conflict resolution processes that might exceed the capacity of your organization. There is also situations where there's a non-alignment of these agendas with the evidence base of what works in conservation. So it could be that there are some win-win approaches that are being promoted at the international and national levels, but they're not feasible or appropriate to use at the local levels, and because they may generate like unacceptable trade-offs amongst local actors. So in this case, an example would be, for example, if a government uses a centralized command and control mechanism for establishing protected areas, when the evidence base within the local context shows that community-based forestry is better for protection of forests. So here, this is a barrier to success. There could also be a critical lack of capacity. So you could have political will with the government, and you might have a sound theory of change, but here is, you might not have the internal or external capacity to do proper strategic planning, to do those sophisticated facilitation and conflict resolution processes, to establish accountability mechanisms, especially, for example, for anti-corruption, and monitoring and evaluation.
Sabina, can I'm just a little conscious of time. So if, and you had the bulk of our conclusions, but if you could, highlight some of the key points just going forward. Is it okay?
Sure.
Thank you.
So, some basic things that we should do to improve the success of this strategy would be ensuring like the continuity of your efforts is not held only with the government. So you should partner with subnational community service organizations so that they can continue your project even if there are changes in government. You can engage with universities and NGOs to establish voluntary reporting mechanisms, which might help maintain any political will that's already established. To help navigate those complex institutional arrangements, you could develop toolkits and roadmaps to help government and other stakeholders understand how to navigate those their roles and responsibilities. You could also offer training opportunities to support that, and you absolutely need interdisciplinary project teams in order to navigate those complex institutions. So our key knowledge gaps and research questions are basically to understand what has been the past performance of these global agendas and what factors have led to either their failure or their success. And what are some pitfalls of using these agendas for conservation? How do you convince governments to embrace like this decentralized decision-making and interministerial collaboration mechanisms? What are some barriers of the corporate sector to committing to these sorts of agendas? How do other organizations leverage these agendas, and how do they see their connection with conservation? And especially, what is the impacts of introducing these sorts of sophisticated discourses within local communities, and what sorts of social safeguards are necessary? So all in all, these agendas are powerful and legitimate tools for conservation work, but they do require interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary teams. You do have to be skillful in your integration of human well-being considerations. You do have to scale, and you do need strategic partnerships. So going forward, we're just going to be strengthening our evidence base for our theory of change, using more case studies and more literature from scientific literature, and hopefully we'll also make a publication out of our work.
Thank you, Sabina. Sorry you had to rush there towards the end. And I know we went over our time, but if people have questions or comments, I noticed that Will had a question, which is really for Tamia, which was, why did the RIA start as a protest against REDD+, and then use REDD+, or did he misunderstand the kind of steps in the process? Tamia?
Hi, sorry. Thank you for the question. I'm going to try to answer the question. I'm not an expert or participated in those discussions at the time, and I was more involved very locally in the implementation of little parts of this project. But from what I gathered and from what I've talked with them, when the REDD+ project started to be or policy, I don't know how to call it, started to be implemented in Peru, there was not really like a policy in place, and all of a sudden there was this boom of all these projects taking place to protect forests, and indigenous people were not, or what I read and what they have told me, is that they were not involved in any, they were not consulted, they did not participate. So they felt that they were left behind, and there was no prior informed consent, so they didn't know what was going on, and all of a sudden forests had all this value, so they call it the carbon pirates. So there was a lot of like not very good feelings about how the REDD projects were taking place, particularly in Peru. So RIA starts in Peru as this feeling that they're not being taken into account, they're not being consulted, they're not, projects come when they're all when they were already developed. So they felt that it wasn't fair to them, it wasn't participatory, and that they were trying to take their territories and take advantage of their full. So that's when they saw the value, it was just that it wasn't being done right, or that's my interpretation, to be honest. I can't speak really for them, but from the readings and the conversations that I've gathered, I think that's what it is. So then they adopted it. Okay, let's have the REDD+. It seems like a very valuable thing, but include us from the beginning, take into consideration, that we have land, and that's why land right is really important for them to because otherwise people are grabbing land and buying land and all that stuff. So it's not that they were against it, but they wanted it to have a more comprehensive indigenous perspective and to be included from the start and not informed at the end. That's the best way I think I can explain it.
Hey, thank you, Tamia. Is that okay, Will? Did that help? Yeah, good. The thumbs up there. And Will, you also asked about how this learning initiative could be further developed and move forward. And I hope that, Sabina's presentation provides some of the thinking we've done. I mean, as I mentioned at the beginning, we feel like this is a work in progress and that we still have a lot to learn and benefit from others. I wanted to thank Dave Kramer. People should look in the chat. He's provided some really interesting insights and places that we can go look for additional information. Amiel, I think, maybe we could, set up another time to talk about, what more we could do and, what that looks like, being skillful at incorporating human well-being into the process. And unfortunately, we don't have time to go into it just now. Oscar has provided a little bit more insight into the sort of situation with Red Plus funding, that it didn't directly go to communities, but rather through third parties, which seems quite typical that happens quite a lot. Did anybody else? I mean, we've sort of overused our allotted time, but if anybody else has a quick question or something they'd like to share, we're perfectly willing to take questions on board and to try and pursue them further after this call. Yes, it's so Althea wants us to, hear more about that skillful incorporating human well-being in the process. Well, I'm going to write that down as a top priority too, since I'm not sure it came out in our list of questions, and we can try and figure out a way for us, perhaps all, to try and discuss that, and what this learning group that had in mind when they proposed that as an action that needed to be undertaken.
Yeah, I think just that the main thing was what we suggested was that you absolutely have to have transdisciplinary teams, and in the scientific literature that means like not simply you can't simply be you could be an ecologist who practices social science very well. But ideally what you're looking for, real hardcore social scientists on your team, able to put forward a different type of way of looking at the problem. So you need the anthropologists, you absolutely need environmental psychologists and whatnot to help you with that human aspect.
Well, thank you. And I have taken it on board because it's something I think that interests all of us. And, perhaps we can get a small group to talk about it a little bit more. Yes, indeed, relying on social science expertise is critical. I think sometimes we don't learn our lessons. I mean, I've been at this a really long time, 30, 35, 40 years. And I feel like we were saying that 35, 40 years ago. So we got to figure out actually how to make it happen instead of just talking about it. Well, we've hit 8 o'clock. So, 8 o'clock in the UK. Where you are, I'm sure it's a different hour. But I'd like to thank everybody who participated, and especially the team that helped me out, Tamia, Charles, and Sabina, and everybody who participated in this learning group. And I really hope that we are able to continue this conversation and this learning together in the future. So thank you very much. Sarah, did you have any last minute words?
Not much from me. Just remember that this is recorded, so it'll be up on YouTube if you'd like to watch anything again. And I'll be sending out those links later this week, so you're able to watch it and send on to any of your colleagues that weren't able to make it. And we will have another of our collaborative learning webinars 2 weeks from now. I believe that's April 7th, talking about protected area funding and COVID-19. So be on the lookout for that, and you can register ahead of time. So, but thank you all for joining.
Excellent.
Thanks,
Bye,
everyone.
everyone.
Thanks. Bye.